Okay, everyone, it is officially 10 a.m. and we are going to kick things off really quick for our Idea to Innovation with UX webinar. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us, whether it's on Facebook Live or if you got the link on Twitter or LinkedIn or however you're here today. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Ruthie Senanayaka, and I will be moderating today's chat with our awesome panelists. So I'm Blueprint's social media manager. So I'd like to introduce the rest of the team to you. Let's go ahead and get started with Thomas Shaw.
Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas Shaw, and I'm a Director of Client Development in Blueprint's South Central region, specifically out of Dallas, Texas, and got about 20 plus years experience, mostly in the data practice areas, but also with a slant toward user experience.
Awesome. And next we'll go over to Florin.
Yeah, hey there, everybody. My name is Florin Mahedinti. I'm a UX architect for Blueprint in solutions delivery. I have an engineering background as well as user experience design. Yeah, looking forward to chatting it up about UX today.
And now to Gary.
Hey everyone, my name is Gary Nakanalua, and I am the Managing Director of Innovation. I run our innovation lab, among other things, and I have the pleasure of working with a lot of different customers and internal teams and just breaking and burning a lot of things.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys all for joining us today. We are going to kick things off with a couple of questions. But if you have questions that come up during our talk, feel free to add them to the Q&A section, and we would love to answer them for you. But just so you know, all the questions that we're talking about right now, they have either come in through you or frequently asked questions in general for UX. So let's kick things off. Let me see, where is my question list? Seems to have gone away. Sorry, just give me one moment. There we go. So the first one we have is, what is the scope of the UX practice at Blueprint? And what is the purpose and goals of this practice in general?
So I'll take that one first. I actually don't, I'm going to deviate it a little bit here, Ruthie. I don't like calling it a practice so much. While Florin is a practice lead, it's something that is pervasive throughout all of Blueprint. It's in every one of our practices as a primary component of it, where everyone has an understanding of UX, user experience, how to apply it, how to leverage it, and it's incorporated into their everyday delivery, whether it's in requirements, whether it's in delivery. From stage one of the project. It's also not a phase of the project at the beginning or at the end. It's just, again, it's pervasive throughout, and not only in delivery, just in our everyday culture. It's just something that we're really proud of, that our people apply and appreciate, and it's we think it's just a primary differentiator in the way we conduct business.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that as well. That's well put. It takes everyone to make this work. The first in the series that we did here about UX at Blueprint, we talked about the why, right? The why of UX, why we undertake design thinking, why we undertake a human-centered approach to our solutions and our own internal products that we offer. And in short, it's partnership alignment, outcome alignment with our partners that we build solutions for. It's about building the right thing. And so just to sum that up, it's getting to things like using data to influence design decisions, creating these long-term partnerships where both parties are aligned to the successful outcome, and getting to hit real targets, KPIs that are aligned with business goals, metrics that are aligned with business goals. Those are some of the things that we truly benefit from practicing good UX all along the spectrum that Thomas was talking about.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question is, how do you communicate the value of UX to various roles in a company?
So being in client development, I think that mostly starts with me, and then the more intelligent people like Gary and Florin come in after. But really, user experience. One of the primary values of it is empathy, being empathetic, understanding your audience. And so whether we're talking to someone in the C-suite, a C-level person, directors, or individual contributors and influencers, you can't go in with the canned agenda of a message, right? You really have to empathize with who you're talking to, what drives them, and how they would leverage user experience and understand the value of it. So, it starts with understanding what the purpose of their initiative, their project, whatever brought you two together that day. And then what we try to do is help align everything with a strategic initiative of the company. Companies come out with strategic goals for the year, and those aren't just for your internal company kickoff for the year or anything. These have a very specific goal in mind. And so how does your project align with that strategic initiative? And then who are the people that are responsible for that, that have liability for that? And we hear about the 3 pillars of delivery a lot being around people, process, and technology, and we think the people piece just gets dismissed a lot. And what it takes to get it done, what makes them tick, and how do you make a sustainable solution for them that will help them achieve their personal goals, and again, how those personal goals align with a strategic initiative. And so we don't like to lead with technology. We like to lead with people. And one of the best UX practices I've ever seen was made up of a bunch of psychology majors, oddly enough. And so they had a passion for data and for technology, but they really were, great at understanding how people operate and what makes them tick. And that was so important, and then help keep them focused on strategic initiatives.
Very cool. Okay, so the next question, if nobody else has anything to add, is how do you align the above roles, everything that you talked about, and the project to the strategic initiative?
Right. So yeah, I guess I alluded to that a little bit, and that can be, we talked a lot in our last webinar about why user experience is important. And today, really, the focus is how do you apply that and be more tangible. And we'll start with something like a project definition workshop. That not a buzzword term. Let's just call it a workshop. And there's some very specific ways we do that to the types of people we invite. The intentions around, like, even down to the color of the sticky note we throw on the wall. Everything's very intentional. It's an intentional practice, and in the way we're gathering requirements from folks, it's not just tell me your pain points. We're not a bunch of therapists that are just saying, hey, tell me your pain points, and we randomly throw it on the wall and hope it sticks. It's a process that in these workshops of how we identify pain points, and again, align those with process, technology, and all the way up to strategic initiatives. But I'm normally just the intro guy to that, and I hand off to Florin or Gary on these, and say, maybe Gary would come in on something like this as an innovation team, and I'll let him talk more about that, because he definitely one of our primary practitioners.
Yeah, and it's cool because you talk about the how. So really, I'll give it an example of how this has been applied. So we were working with one of our larger technology partners, and what they were looking to do is figure out a way to work with this federal intelligence agency and kind of get them to take advantage of some of the core aspects of their platform. And so as we're talking with the partner, and then we kick things off with their customer, all within that project definition workshop that Thomas mentioned. And what that did was, as we were moving through the facilitated innovation approach, that workshop allowed all of the stakeholders to really come together around the core value, right? And what was the goal for this whole group of people to come together, and what's the goal of the project itself, and really got people aligned. And it helped build that trust and really get commitment from everyone involved. And then as we kept progressing, kind of going back to that how, one of those key aspects, whether it's on the innovation side or anywhere, was you just have to constantly show progress. So as you're building this trust and you're getting this feedback from folks and letting them see how that integrates into the overall experience of whatever the solution is. It's important to show that early and often, like just so incredibly important. And Florin, I think you could probably talk a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, going back to the original question, aligning the all of those roles and the project itself to, I think you were talking about the strategic initiative. I think that's super important. But what I've seen also be successful about the way we run our workshops early on in a project is it primes the team for this type of communication, you know, that you know, I'll call a design language. And so that is such an important mechanism to establish early on in a project. And I think a workshop like this that kind of literally enables everybody on the team that's inside of that workshop to say, all right, now we're all, let's get on the same page in terms of what we're solving. Let's understand the business goals. Let's understand the user's need. Let's understand your particular need as a stakeholder. And then let's try to align those, right? Because without that, we're going to be steered and being pulled in multiple different directions. And so I think that the workshop that we run really primes the team to build that design language. And that takes a while. It's not something that's going to be solved in that workshop, but it's something that it sparks the conversation there. And I've just seen that be so successful with our engagements.
It's true. You just can't start user experience design early enough. And when we talked in the last webinar about, so many people confuse user experience just with aesthetics, with UI, user interface. And it's not just the aesthetics. I think Steve Jobs even said something like, it's not what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. It's the experience. It's the outcomes of what you do. And so the experience that a user is feeling or experiencing really, and when using an application. And so, just one thing we like to say is you can't design an experience. You can only design for an experience, and that starts day one. You just can't start it early enough.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. That was super insightful. And kind of going along that workshop theme that you were talking about, I know in today's day and age, everything is remote, but how do you do a design workshop remotely? I mean, is there certain ways that you guys have been seeing lately that make more sense than others?
Yeah, it's a great question. Was thrust upon us last spring, I guess, for late winter. Within quarantine, obviously we had done a lot of virtual meetings, but things like user experience workshops in trying to empathize, it's so powerful to have that in-person presence. And and when presented with this challenge, we had to be able to overcome it. But it's not just that. We talked about things like just the color of the sticky note, and everything's intentional. And we're doing these workshops and these sessions, and there's a lot of creativity. How can we still do that? And virtualizing this ideation process. So we're a Microsoft heavy shop. We mostly use Microsoft Teams internally. We're technology agnostic externally, but even with Teams, within Zoom, Google Hangouts, WebEx, all the major players, those that ever got it, shame on me. But most of them, I think Google Hangouts has a third party, but most of them have a whiteboarding tool. And we've really accelerated our skills on how to master the whiteboarding tool and put in the same way we would do in a live physical session, in the way we use the notes and the things that we apply and make those utilities. And so it's leveraging the technology, and the technology has advanced so much in the last 8 or 9 months. Anybody that's using Teams and Zoom and some of these tools, you notice quite a few upgrades that have come in. I don't know how many meetings I've come into and like, oh no, my buttons are in new places. But that's our responsibility to stay on top of that and be able to not lose value in that process.
Yeah, and I can give you a direct example of how we can use multiple tool sets to accomplish something like a workshop, and not just a workshop, but maybe like the full communication stream, design wise and development wise, everything. On one project that I'm working on, we use Teams for our, stand-ups, for our video conferencing. We use it for the file library, things like that we really benefit from that area. But, we found that it's a better communication mechanism, at least for this team, to use Slack. This is something that was already embedded in the team that we converged with. And we found no reason to just say, oh, focus on Teams for this communication. It's whatever is highly effective. We as a company are flexible in that way, right? So we're happy to jump in and jump on Slack and make sure that we have our streams of communication there. But this is something the workshop actually helps with, identifying the best ways to communicate, not just communicate your designs, but communicate like as a team. Hey, we're gonna stick to this, and we're gonna be consistent with this, and we're gonna do that. And then another thing I'll touch on is specifically research methods. So doing UX research in a particular problem you're trying to solve is incredibly important. And if you're familiar with some research activities like contextual analysis, one-on-one interviews, things like affinity diagrams, those are really, really important. And surprisingly, some of that stuff is great in person, and it's absolutely, it's been done in the past, generally in person, but we've benefited a lot from some of the virtualization of those kind of methods. And, things like being able to record a one-on-one interview. You could have done that before, but it was just less likely. Now it's almost, absolutely necessary to be able to do that. Record the one-on-one interview so you can go back and start reading through and be like, oh, that's what they said there, here and there. You can capture a snippet. And so we also use, multiplayer type tools, where if you're trying to identify what's the most important feature for somebody that you're doing research on, you can have them move the little card onto, a spectrum or a scale, right? And so those things we've actually benefited from in this kind of COVID time that we have to move everything online. So we're lucky that we're set up in that kind of technological environment.
Yeah, and there was something, Florin, that you said around taking advantage of video, and given the state of everything today, the opportunity, one of the opportunities we have is actually to be a lot more efficient and mindful of people's time by taking advantage of that, right? And so some of the things that we do on a regular basis is pre-COVID, and the normal reaction by people is, oh, let me call a meeting and let me get a bunch of people together. And then what you would find oftentimes in your calendar is you're moving from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, right? It's just back to back to back to back. And this is being recorded, so I'll just go on record as saying, like, productivity doesn't happen in meetings. Like there's a reason we call them workshops, because you're there to work. But a meeting, like there's so much better use of people's time, unless it's a decision making, sure. And so what we have found really, really helpful is some of those things where people would normally call meetings to do a demo. We pre-record them now. Pre-record them, send them out to people, let them consume them on their own time, whenever that is, so they can come into the meeting that you do need to have with an understanding and be able to provide feedback and give that like decision and accelerate that decision making, right? And so really, we have the opportunity, I love our approach is, if you think about it, if we could remove 2 to 3 meetings from your calendar a day by truly taking advantage of, like Florin mentioned, like, video recording and things like this, think of them like mini webinars, right? That you can record and go, cool, like, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to see this, and then they can consume it, and then you come back together. Like, that's a powerful thing. If I can give you back an hour and a half, 2 hours of your day, like, think what people can do with that amount of time.
Are we on record for that now? I think we are. Nice.
Awesome. Great stuff, guys. So the next question is, how do you bring alignment to a cross-functional team consisting of various different roles?
Yeah, I can definitely take that one. So I talked about the design language and developing a common team design language. I think that's incredibly important. To bring that alignment, you need to communicate incredibly fast. You need to show fast and show often. You need to show it in the right way. You need to be strategic about how to use your design artifacts to ask questions. I can give you a direct example of this. So we, we're working on something where we don't have everything defined. We don't have all of the project requirements defined out front. It's just not going to happen where you're going to know exactly what it is you're going to build from day one. And so because of that, as we're going in and designing, and we use something like a wireframe or a storyboard that contains wireframes to tell this kind of story from start to finish. This specific instance, I chose not to use placeholder text. And to give you a little bit more context about this, if I'm building a component that is meant to convey what the item that I'm holding inside of, say, a list, if you're specific about the actual title of that each individual item, that's gonna elicit feedback from whoever you're showing that to. That's gonna suggest that, like, oh, this kind of item needs to go here, versus just leaving it open with lorem ipsum and saying, so on and so forth. So I was very strategic. I left lorem ipsum on most parts, but then added very specific titling to the list items. And what that did was it actually, when I demoed it very quickly, it was during stand-up, I was hoping that someone would chime in and ask the question, wait, are we, is this item that we're talking about, is it, I don't want to get too into the weeds about it, but it's more about, like, they asked questions that I had a hunch that they would feel strongly about. So it prompted this conversation inside of this meeting that led to a decision that I was hoping to make with this design document. And that's an example of, like, how to use design artifacts as a communication tool. Of course, they're going to end up being artifacts in the sense that they'll guide you, they'll be your North Star, and you'll need to update them to reflect that. But this common team design language is just so important to get, because now what I do is I have this rapport. I, show things really, really fast as I have it. And I go, does anybody have any questions on this? Yes, no, boom. And so that's the kind of alignment that you can get with design specifically.
Awesome. I love those examples. So the next one that I want to talk about is, we've talked about how certain ideas of UX are theoretical, but how do you change that from theoretical to applied?
Right, so make it less abstract, I guess. And yeah, user experience does have a perception at times of kind of being fluff or just this kind of abstract concept. But, it's again, that's where, we think we come in and we have methods that zero it in and make it measurable. You don't have to be a psychologist. It's not one type of personality or role that it takes to undertake this. And then it's the way we move it from theoretical, this abstract concept, to really applied, objective, measurable results is through data. And
I want to pop in really quick, Thomas. So I know before you did mention that one of the most successful outcomes you've seen is because of psychology. So what do you mean by data versus psychology?
I didn't think you were listening. Yeah, call me out there. That is true. They so one of the best practices I saw had quite a few psychology majors or folks with that background, but I hope I did clarify that they had a slant toward technology, a passion for technology, and specifically data. While they have some intangibles that they can bring to the table that you can help with some of the empathy, they still rely so much on data. You research market data, and Gary, his innovation team relies on this so much. I'll let him talk more about that because that's Blueprint's bread and butter. And so he can talk more about how that is more of an objective thing. But thanks for calling me out, Ruthie. That's good.
Yes, well played on that one, Ruthie. But it's a good point, that moving from subjective to objective. And the interesting thing is, it's easy to identify when that happens because you kind of there's times where there's that loudest voice in the room syndrome, like whoever is there and saying something the loudest, that must be truth type of thing, right? But then there's also other ways where that subjectivity kind of rears its ugly head in these cases where someone will go, oh, well, we want to do it the right way. Well, even in that context, that term right is subjective. What is right to you may not be what's right to me. And then other ways is where opinion or belief is backed up by data. So this is an interesting play because it's interesting, like if you read the history of Google Glass, for example, and what they went through to kind of come to the conclusions. So you've got Larry Page, co-founder of Google, and I think the gentleman's name was Tom Cho, who was leading the development of this thing. And so they're sitting there and they go, well, if we're going to project something in front of people, Larry Page stands up and goes, well, we should do it in red. And the reason we should do it in red is because scientific studies show that red is the color that is least tiresome to the eye, meaning we don't have to work very hard to process red as a color. And so he backed up his very subjective view with data, but it was still a subjective view. Everyone stood up and went, oh, well, it's Larry Page and he co-founded this company and he's the boss and he just threw this scientific study out there. It must be truth. Well, Tom stepped in and was like, I don't know if that's true, so we're gonna go validate. So they put together just really ridiculous, like crazy prototype with like this little Pico projector that projected on this piece of plastic, and they fashioned this thing out of a wire coat hanger, and they got it in front of people. And he actually cycled some UI elements in front of people and asked them like which one was easier for them to use. And it turned out that although scientifically speaking, red is the color that the eye can process with the least amount of effort, it was incredibly hard for people to see what was being projected. The experience itself was not good. And so, and the cool thing, at least as the story goes, is that Larry Page goes, all right, great. So what color is it going to be? And Tom was able to show like, it's actually blue is the color that people really resonate with. And then they started, there are stories of Google experimenting with various shades of blue for link colors and things like that. But all of that aside, it wrapped up in all of that, and Thomas kind of spoke to this, is you got to have those mechanisms that you can gather real feedback, right? That's the key, like getting feedback, because otherwise these things exist as thought experiments. I think it should look like this, have these things here. Here are the patterns that exist in the design world. Florence talked about, a design language. You can interpret that in a lot of different ways. And so, but until you get it in front of people and they go, yep, this makes sense to me. Nope, this does not make sense to me. Like that is absolutely critical, especially when it comes to the things that are going on in the business today and the type of experience that you want to have with users. So by having those mechanisms in place and then incorporating that feedback into the designs themselves, what that helps do is it really avoids those sort of, pseudo political / religious debates that people will have, right? Like even earlier when I was talking that story about, Larry Page, like he could stand up and be like, I'm right because I got science behind me. You're right in that you do have science in that statement you made, but I have feedback from people who are actually going to be using this, and it suggests that this is the better way, right? So really having those mechanisms in place and funneling that and incorporating that into the experience is absolutely critical.
Awesome, thank you. And so my last question, before I ask this last question, if anyone has additional questions they would like answered, make sure you add it to the Q&A box and we'll definitely ask those afterward. But the last question I have is, how do you make it tangible? We've talked about all this data, but how do you actually get that and so you can act on it?
Yeah, I can take that one. That's that's the hard part, but it's also the fun part. You know, gathering data in order to use telemetry to lead design decisions. I think that's super important. You know, I call it informed design, and what Gary talked about is highly relevant. The feedback that you get from all of this research that you do, which I'll go into some methods, but that feedback that you get will be your friend. It is your facilitator that will facilitate the outcome that you want to achieve, and it is it's objective. It is and that's why we were talking about, I think we were talking about subjective into objective, and it's not, it's something you can point to, right? So nobody's going to go in and say the data is wrong, right? You know, because if you have true data points that you use to make your design decisions, that again, that's what you want to be at. So yeah, sometimes you don't have that much quantifiable data or quantitative data, but you can use qualitative data to be able to get to these results as well. Sometimes you have to start with data points that you make up because you just don't have it. But what happens there is you'll be able to say, okay, here we have X number of people who completed X task. It took them this long, right? You pull that in, you step out a little bit, you've got 3 of those data points, and then you can say, all right, we need to design a component to this solution that increases that metric. And so in order to get to that point, you got to do one-on-one interviews, you got to do some contextual analyses, you've got to maybe some narrative. So you've got an interview with somebody as a researcher on the team. It doesn't even have to be a researcher, right? It could be, you could be working on as a product manager on the team. You're still able to ask these design thinking type questions to say, okay, can you walk me through the current flow that you have, the current journey to get from point A to point B, all the way to point D or E, right? And you start writing those down. And then what you do is you keep those somewhere and you interview somebody else. You go, you know, you keep going, you go 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 is a good point. Once you have that, you have enough to start garnering patterns, and you start finding patterns in the answers, and you go, okay, there's a pain point here, there's a pain point there. And that's data right there, right? It's not a tremendous amount of, quantitative data. And sometimes you have projects where, yeah, you've got a lot of quantitative data. You've got e-commerce companies that come to you and say, all right, we have these amount of sales, these amount of folks that are leaving our website, 30 seconds after they join up. Here's the data to prove that. How can we improve upon this? Sometimes that data already exists. Sometimes we have to build the data points. Sometimes we have to do our best to kind of like guess and check, because if you don't do that, you don't have an A and B to test. So, going through something like A/B testing is impossible later on. So it's just important to set that up early on. You'll be able to test those assumptions later. It's just a matter of like setting them up, and as such, you are setting up your solution that you're building for success. So I think it's super, super important. Do you have any other like specific questions around, I think the question was around like, how do you get that data? I talked about some one-on-one interviews, some kind of research methods that we can do. I can go deeper into that if you want. But
just to pile on to what Florence said is, it's our responsibility to bring in that market data, the competitive intelligence, a lot of things we call it. But when he talked about interviewing 5 different people on the same thing, that's building perspectives. And so again, to draw it back to the first thing we used to describe user experience in here today is developing empathy. How do you develop empathy? Well, and that's through data, but it's also through a number of perspectives. Every time you get different people's perspectives, now you can understand, truly, the differences in how they feel about their user experience, whether it be an application or a business process, whatever it may be. We're building those different perspectives, and perspective is what it takes to build empathy. Freud might say something different, but we're going to go with what we think on that today. And it's and then that's just, again, when all the data is not there, that's our responsibility to gather those perspectives, to be able to build that opinion.
You know, I have something that yeah, that's kind of sparked, you know, what Gary works on with facilitated innovation is just such a good example of taking data and innovating. And essentially this whole idea of like idea to innovation starts with this facilitated innovation that kind of Gary heads up and is the mastermind behind. But it truly, you could probably speak to those data points better than anybody else, because you've used them to your advantage, right? To be able to make the case for, this is why we need to make this bold move in our design, right? It's a bold move, but without actual evidence and backing up of that data, you're really getting anywhere with your stakeholders, right?
Yeah, it's the interesting thing is the way you describe that. Like we effectively employ the scientific method in this, right? Like, so, and that really starts, number one is through observation, right? Like literally, like we immerse ourselves. Florin and Shaw both like holistically, not just on the facilitated innovation side, but as a company, like we immerse ourselves in not just the problem, but what people are doing in an attempt to solve that problem, what has been tried previously, what is kind of working. And so that immersion is so incredibly important. And then again, you know, very much like that scientific method, it's, you know, observing and taking notes and doing these things. And then from that observation, making that hypothesis, right? It's, you know, like I said earlier, you know, Larry Page, you know, his hypothesis was make it all red, right? And I have some data to back up my hypothesis. Doesn't mean it's proven, right? The hypothesis hasn't been validated or invalidated yet. And then Tom Cho goes on and goes, cool, I'm going to validate or invalidate your hypothesis accordingly. You run your experiment, and then you take the results of that experiment and you go, all right, well, it wasn't red. I have a hypothesis, it should be yellow. All right, well, run it again, another experiment, and then you rinse and repeat, right? And so it's one of those things where like it brings that sense of tangibility and progress to user experience, so that it doesn't get treated as just like this, like, you know, face value activity that unfortunately happens in many organizations.
Awesome. I did have one question that came in. So this one is, how do you integrate into a project where it is under-prioritized or undervalued?
And by it, you mean user experience?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'll jump in since I came off mute really fast there. So one thing to keep in mind is the people that are, everyone is responsible for the experience. That's the first thing to understand. Like, it is a responsibility of not just a singular individual, a singular department, but the entire organization. It's really important, but like is necessary. You have to have, you know, focus areas and things of that nature. And so especially those people, right, they really have to be those evangelists, right? And they have to be maniacal about user experience. I mean, just, and you can get that from Thomas and Florin on this webinar, like just absolutely maniacal about user experience. It starts there, right? But then at the same time, you have to really be mindful of hubris in this, because when you get super excited about something, as humans, we tend to make the mistake that transference of that excitement is very easy. Like, can't you see I'm excited? You should be excited. I understand it. You should understand it. Wait, you don't understand? What is wrong with you? Right? That's the wrong conversation to have, right? And that's an easy way, because the person on the other side who's responsible for the outcome itself and to the business is going, this isn't my problem to understand you, right? Like, no. You have to make me understand, right? And so really, like, that's the responsibility of this. The importance of it is on the individual who brings it, and they just have to be just, again, it's evangelism in its purest form, right? Evangelism is that transference of enthusiasm. You have to like really do that. And so you got that, but it's not just enough to have people jumping up and down and going, user experience, right? You have to show, this goes all the way back before, right? You have to show, like, people have to know that if I'm going to spend an hour with you in a one-on-one interview, like Florin talks about, which is very important, they got to know that there's value to that you just didn't decide to get together to shoot the breeze or whatever. So show me something. I just gave you an hour of my time. Show me something. And so it's important, that responsibility.
Sorry, I have to chime in on that, because that's so easy to do, right? Like as somebody that maybe owns the product, owns maybe or manages the team, you want to make sure everybody's time is utilized properly. So, you know, going back to the question of like, how do you make sure it's valued? How do you make sure that that it's consistently applied throughout the project? And that exactly what you just said is, you know, you need to make sure to take the time to discuss the reasoning behind this, right? What is this going to get us, right? What is a one-on-one interview? What is one of 5 interviews going to get us in the long term, whether it's a 90-day project, 6-month, whatever it may be? Where is it going to get us? And what I've seen from experience is it takes commitment and consistency. That will show itself eventually, but you do have to do your due diligence ahead of time. You have to champion it, and it has to be championed from every angle. That's why all 3 of us are in here, right? Because we work in different kind of areas of the project. But if you have folks that are embedded into it and that champion this process, then there's no question at that point. That's where your backing is for doing the research work. And then eventually it pays for itself. It eventually then your stakeholders or your managers or you know, leaders are going to look at that and go, oh, that's why you did this interview. That's why you sent out this survey to, you know, my whole organization. That's what came out of this. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that value is communicated ahead of time and afterwards, because we use it. We use that information and all the activities that happen throughout that. But some of it is going to explain itself. And that's what I was trying to get at, is that consistency is key. Staying super consistent. It's hard to stay the course on something, but we've done it so much here at Blueprint that it's kind of ingrained in us. And so it's much easier for us to do and speak to it, because we don't forget about what it's actually going to get us in the long run.
Sure. Consistency, and I think you got to go back to Gary's word of being maniacal. Like Gary and I battle on being the maniac on the project. So it's
yes,
that part comes easy.
I actually have a great example of this, and I don't know if Gary, you even remember this, but last year, you, Florin, and I were working on a very small project, but I was on it from a marketing perspective, and you guys were working on it as well. And it was so funny because we were talking about it, we whiteboarded the whole thing, and then Gary's like, Ruthie, grab your coat. We're going on a field trip. I'm like, what are we doing? And he did not tell
sounds
me
like Gary.
anything about this. And so we walked over to the mall, and he took me to the store, and he was asking me questions of, hey, what stands out to you about what we're looking at right now? What, you know, all of these questions that in his mind, he was gathering all the answers to, so that we can really make sure our product was going to work in a way that, you know, was going to really be effective. And I thought it was so cool because, you know, it works in so many different ways. And this reminded me, I mean, I remembered all this because you guys were bringing out all these points of like a workshop or, you know, taking notes from different data. And it's all of that is there. And even though I don't necessarily work directly in UX or UI, I see you guys' excitement for it, and it makes me so excited about it too. So thank you guys. Thank
You're
you
part
for
of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. That's so cool that you brought that up. That particular project also, one more thing I'd say about this whole process is that we move fast with that one, right? Like that's something that happened quick. We put it out there, and we were done, and we were able to test, you know, what capabilities that it had right away. And we weren't slowed down. I think that's key. I think like, you know, I call it failing fast. You know, and failing forward, right? Because if you do that early enough, what you're just doing is just making minor adjustments here and there. And if I turn this all the way back on its head to the original, you know, part one of this is, what kind of ROI can we get from UX? Well, you know, one big one, just as it relates to failing forward and failing fast, is reducing that cost of change, because their cost of change is only going to go up the longer you're in on that project. It's going up, up, and up, and up. So the sooner you make changes, and the sooner you exhaust your ability to, you know, your design kind of variations, just go through them earlier on. And if you do that, you end up with a really good design that fits your users' needs, matches the business goals, and your cost of change is going to be much lower. So any investment that you put in UX practices is made up strictly on that. So it's super important to mention that, I think.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions we've had for today, but I just want to say thank you everyone for joining. If you did want to get in touch with us, feel free to hop on LinkedIn. You can look up Gary, Florin, Thomas, or I and get in touch, or you can email info@bpcs.com and we'd be happy to get you connected with one of our experts. But thanks again for joining, and thanks to our panelists for taking the time to chat with all of us and give us some really, really valuable insights. Once again, if you have any questions, just email info@bpcs.com. But thanks all for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.